Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a holistic coach and trauma-informed practitioner. This podcast seeks to break out of the echo chamber of societal narratives that perpetuate our institutions and challenge the status quo of wellness and beyond. Join me as we decolonize our minds, address and use our privilege, and prioritize inclusivity. Here, diverse experiences are honoured, and together we are fostering a space that stands for higher love for all. As a listener, you are not just here to passively consume. You're an ambassador for deep healing and societal evolutions, ready to engage in thought-provoking, challenging conversations. As your host, I'm committed to providing ever-expansive spaces that inspire us to contribute to a world defined by higher love. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Up on the podcast this week, we have Leah Kim. Leah is the host of the Voices on the Side podcast, which centers stories of marginalized identities as an antidote to white supremacy. Her guests have a variety of backgrounds. Some are thought leaders actively focused on the fight for collective liberation, whilst others share stories rooted in their personal history. As people of the global majority, Leah's podcast contributes to resisting oppression through an insistence to live, create, be seen and heard, exploring narratives that remind us of our shared humanity. I came across Leah's podcast, Voices on the Side, through her episode with Paris Abbas entitled Beyond Colonial Spirituality, and immediately I felt like this was someone that I needed to connect and converse with. Enjoy. Thank you so much for being here, Leah. It's really great to connect with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So I first came across your podcast, Voices on the Side, via seeing a friend of mine had posted your episode with Paris Abbas. And it wasn't even that long ago. I think it was only a couple of months ago or something like that. But immediately when I heard this conversation between you guys, I was like, this is someone that I need to connect with and someone that I need to speak to. I really just felt so much sense within that conversation. For those who haven't yet come across your podcast, I'd love for you just to talk about what Voices on the Side is, what it's about, and also how has that evolved since its inception to where you are now?
Yes, I started thinking I would just do 8 episodes. Like I was very resistant to having a podcast because how many podcasts are in the world? Like 10 million? I don't know. There's so many, right? And so I was very resistant and I was like, okay, I will have a set of interviews with people that I felt really, I like that we shared an identity. Like I felt like I had to stay in my box and my lane. And I interviewed Asian women essentially because I'm an Asian woman. My main sort of like seed of intention was to be able to talk about racism, to talk about discrimination, systemic oppression, but to do it in this like narrative sharing way where it's not like a didactic, hey, these are all the things wrong with our world. But because I've noticed that throughout my life, having those conversations within real relationships puts people's backs up. And so many of the cliche defenses come up. If I try to talk about any sort of racism, often one of the first things is they're poor white people too. Or like, how do you know racism? You grew up in California. That's so diverse. So all these things. And I realized that there were these very common stereotypical responses that were coming. And it just made me think that people aren't really listening to the stories of actual people who have lived through discrimination and also learning to separate what might be happening one-on-one with somebody and what is happening systemically. And so it was all originally people that I knew or was like 1 degree removed from. And I found myself just loving the conversations. Like I was like, this is fun and I think useful. It's like a useful way to bring this necessary conversation in a way that I hoped that people who were not of the same identity could relate. And so after that first kind of season, I was like, okay, I'll do another season. But I still stayed in my box. My whole thing at that point was I'm going to reach out to people that I don't know in real life So I just did the whole randomly DMing people who I admired, which I used to feel really uncomfortable with, but now again, like I think it's normal. And I started getting really interesting guests. And so I kept going with that. And then I'm like, I don't want to only talk to like women. Let me try to reach out to men, non-binary folks. So I changed my sort of guidelines for who I was reaching out to. And I'm like, I'm just going to reach out to all, quote, marginalized identities, just meaning like people whose stories are not seen in the mainstream. And then October 7th happened. And I think like many of us was confused. I just was not informed on what was happening in Palestine ever. Especially as a mother and seeing that it was a huge percentage of children that were being harmed, it just completely radicalized everything. My brain, like my values, just I was like, how do I help? What can I do? Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, I have this platform that exists. And again, thinking about how to tell people important information through narrative sharing. Because I learned from like reading books, but usually hearing someone's story, hearing about their experience, their parents, grandparents' experience, like that just is a different flavor to it. And so I just shifted to who will talk to me about Palestine. And so that's where it is now. And it's not every single conversation centers Palestine necessarily, but for the most part, my conversations do center the idea of liberation for all. Yeah. And the wellness piece it did really shock me the way that overall the wellness industry has been ignoring what's been happening. And it was a big wake-up call. So those are some conversations that, I've had in there too with Paris, as you mentioned.
Building on obviously hearing about the evolution of your podcast, what would you say that Voices on the Side now really stands for as a podcast within itself?
It's my one-liner is centering marginalized identities as an antidote to white supremacy. Yeah. And I know when people hear white supremacy, that's another term that gets people, I think, on the defense in a lot of ways. But even with Hollywood, even with just entertainment media, it became so obvious, like how things have been curated culturally to set the average. I'll just talk for Americans since I'm an American, but the average American we've been set up to think that people that look a certain way are better, more trustworthy, smarter, more capable, more deserving of life than people who look a different way. And I think because my identity, I am marginalized as a woman, we're marginalized in the patriarchy, right? As an Asian person, marginalized because I'm not white in this country. But I'm also incredibly privileged because I didn't grow up poor. I didn't have any college, like school debt. My parents were able to afford. I went to a state school, but still my parents were able to afford my schooling. So I have so many privileges. So I feel like I straddle both sides of this like supremacist world, this supremacist system of I kind of know how to work with my privileges to get the benefits. And even little things like tone switching, like talking in a certain way, using certain vocabulary. Like I know what legitimizes me in like the white gaze, the American gaze, Western gaze. And I know that because even though I'm a person of color, I'm Asian. I'm not Black, I'm not Arab. And so I just feel like it's because I can see that and I experience that, I can see which side needs more light shown on it. And it's all the marginalized identities. And it's not just race, right? It's why I really reach out to a lot of people that identify non-binary, queer, and I'm trying to go more and more into what a marginalized identity really is. Because again, I know like I come from so much privilege through my own marginalized identity. And I can see that the one main root, so much of this hate and injustice is supremacy, and it harms white people too, is the thing. So you just see that I have the podcast, I keep it going because these conversations are hard and they're layered and there's so many viewpoints. There's being American versus being British. It's already different. And again, depending on what your race is perceived to be, even for BIPOC, like, totally different for a Black man versus my experience. And I just think more of that needs to just be seen and talked about and listened to. And my mainstream doesn't provide that.
Yeah.
Like mainstream continues to put us as we're continued to be tokenized. Like it's, you see it everywhere, like the nerdy Asian friend, or like the cool Black friend, or there's all these tropes that are continually pushed.
There are so many things I want to speak to right now. Just to backtrack on something that you just said of how white supremacy also harms white people. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
I can only speak from this side of not being a white person, but I feel like it brings out the worst. If someone comes, if I think about my husband and when I've tried to talk to him about racism, and I know he has a huge heart, like he's not a discriminatory person, like that's not his personality.
Yeah.
But unless you actively disentangle from white supremacy, you're going to be impacted by it. So I know he could have an array of responses to something I say about white supremacy. And if he's coming from the unconscious fold of white supremacy, it's going to bring out his worst response. Something just like or maybe calling me racist. Why are you talking about race all the time? You're being racist. Or if he's more connected to his humanity, regardless of this supremacy, regardless of this system of privilege, then he's going to be able to come more from this place of, oh my God, I hear you. Like, how can I understand more? And so, yeah, it's harmful for all of us. And it's hard to see that when you think you're at the top, when you think you're benefiting, you are benefiting on like a superficial level. But like people talk a lot about soul loss. Like, I don't know if you've been seeing that conversation over the last 10 months. I think about the state of someone's soul to be able to defend a baby being blown apart, like to be able to defend that at all. You're just like, what's happening to your soul? And I think that's the price you pay to uphold systems that pull humanity apart.
I feel like there is so much willingness and curiosity that really needs to be brought with this level of interrogation, and being very willing to look at our like kind of unconscious or immediate responses to something. Like I saw something online the other day which was talking about white women, like white women do this, white women do that, and I was reading it being like, but I'm a white woman and I don't do that, and wanting to not identify myself with that, but then watching how that was triggering me and watching myself be triggered by that. And I was like, oh, there's my white privilege. Like my white privilege is responding to this and is being triggered. Like that's so interesting. And then was able to take a step back and be like, so why is that? And then use that as another little like bit of the interrogation process within myself, and then step back to be like, okay, how can I remove that? How can I disidentify from that? And then just be present back in the room with this conversation and try and understand what is being said here. So I feel like there is this like real shift in, for all of us, but especially, as a white person, really having to disentangle myself with all of my unconscious ways that I would ordinarily respond to a lot of these things.
Yeah. Being a part of revolution, of change, of any growth requires work. And if you are in a place of privilege, it requires some degree of sacrifice. And it's not saying there's this thing of a white supremacist thought of, if we make Black people equal to white people, then white people lose. There's this, and it's that dehumanizing thing again. It's no, equal means equal. It doesn't mean like you lose. But it's supremacist, colonized thinking, very binary thinking, to be like, wait, if we allow people, and it's the same with like suffrage, right? Like women's when like women didn't have the right to vote and there was all this fear around, oh no, we can't let them have the vote. Like, no, we all should be equal. Yeah, when you start to realize that you are part of the problem, there's like maybe guilt, shame, a lot of like heavy, darker emotions that come with that. But it also means, wait, that means if I change something in my behavior, my existence, in my life, that takes me out of the problematic position of privilege, of unearned privilege at the expense of other identities, then I can bring things more into balance. Like I actually have power.
Yeah.
In that way. It's very actually empowering to be like, then, so I can't speak as a white person, obviously, but as an Asian person, because racism just is a spectrum, right? I can be like those people who are finding Hollywood representation or whatever and being like, yeah, Asians are finally being seen. I could just stay there perpetuating racism ultimately. Or I could be like, hey, I recognize that my community is part of the problem because we're not speaking up. We're only focused on our own issue. Mm. By virtue of that, I am part of the problem. I'm not the most oppressed. So what can I do to help those that are more oppressed?
You've talked about representation versus this kind of much greater idea of collective liberation. So how would you define collective liberation? What does this mean to you?
It is such like a big term that's thrown about a lot, but I think collective liberation just means ultimately being equal to every other human being and recognizing that while there are millions of children starving on the other side of the world, we cannot possibly be okay in the West. And I think for me, like I said, I really didn't know anything prior to October about Palestine specifically, but I also didn't even really deeply understand Western imperialism. And I really did grow up thinking Americans are good. And I also grew up thinking non-white people are less good about myself, about other races. That was less conscious. It was more just like cultural grooming, just growing up here, which is why we like try so hard to be as white as possible. Like Asians are where I think we are like the most white adjacent of people of color because of many things. But so I had all these thoughts, and that is not freedom for me to exist thinking I am not as good because I was not born white. And I could see how it impacted so much of how I was living my life, like so much of what I thought made me worthy. When just even like Instagram, when Instagram first started, I was already teaching yoga at that point for probably almost 10 years. I was 30 at the time, 30, 31, and I didn't grow up in social media like age really. And so, but everyone's telling you have to build up a social media following, you have to build a brand, you have to get likes and followers. And I completely bought into that. And I looked for that as my own legitimacy. And it was so harmful. And 2014 is when I had my first kid, and I had built a bit of a following as a yoga teacher before that point, and just the cliche yoga, what you'd expect a yoga teacher to post. Like that's how I lived on Instagram. And I couldn't do that anymore once I became a mom because it just wasn't my reality. Like it just wasn't my day to day. It wasn't my life. And I think that really contributed to my postpartum depression. I had my mental health was just, I don't think I had any mental balance for years. And it seems funny to point to Instagram. It's not just Instagram, but it's what it represents. It's like the presenting my way, packaging myself in like a certain way for approval. And in order for me to then to receive that as message that like, I'm okay, I'm whatever worthy. And it's such a prison to live like that. But that's like the messaging we all get that's being constantly reinforced by Hollywood, by reality TV, by other people on Instagram. And so all of these things are ultimately like disconnecting us from our actual humanity, which I think like being liberated is being exactly as you are, being curious to understand what are my values, what makes me joyful, what matters to me, rather than being told, hey, you have to look a certain way. You're not white. You're never going to be white. Here are the other things you can do to try to get as close to that as possible. Like all this stuff. That's not freedom to live like that.
I know that we're both trained yoga teachers and taught within that space. How have your ideas around what yoga, wellness, and spirituality changed?
It's so completely changed, which has been a very disorienting awakening. Because I started doing yoga in my early teens, and I started teaching when I was 23, and it was my full-time thing. And I really bought everything that people talk about when it comes to yoga, that teachers say in class, the whole idea of creating peace within myself will lead to peace in the world. If there's war in the world, that's because it's like manifesting what's psychologically in each of us individually. So, what can I uncover or release within my body and my being? And that will help heal the world. That was my mindset. And I would even jokingly say to friends when I was going to go teach, like, I'm off to save the world. And a lot of us said that, one dog, down dog at a time. And I really believed it. I really was like, what we are doing when we show up on our mats is ultimately like a selfless thing. Like it's just a byproduct that I am physically and mentally more balanced. Like I would, because that's what we're told. And if teacher trainings also, I think for the most part, invite you to read spiritual texts from like centuries ago, right?
Yeah.
And so you're like, oh, the original yogis were like connecting with the divine and whatever, all the lessons and practices that are meant to connect you more deeply. Like and so I would be like, okay, that's what these ancient texts are saying. And then that's what this current new age modern yoga world is parroting. So it must be true. If we just all do that, then it will like good will prevail in the world. And going back to when I became a mom and was deeply depressed, not even just depression, it was like panic attacks, insomnia, like I was not well. And I was like, okay, I know how to bring myself into balance. I just have to do more yoga and meditate. And it didn't work. I actually got the most panic attacks when I went to a yoga class. If I sat down to meditate, as soon as I closed my eyes, I would just be anxious, feel claustrophobic. And of course, what I did was turn it on myself at the time. I was like, oh my God, I must be a bad yogi. Like I must be a bad teacher. I must not be doing this right because it's not working. Because it was coming from the mindset of control. You can control your mental health by X, Y, and Z, like this like spiritual practice. And that's what the wellness world sells. And then they add on the message of, and that is going to be reflected in the world. So really what you're doing is this altruistic thing for the collective. And because it wasn't working, I naturally withdrew from being that deeply ingrained in the community. I was still in it because it was still my job, but even teaching over time more and more became like I was trying to wear clothes that didn't fit me anymore. Like it just didn't feel right. And it was in 2019 that I was like, I'm going to take a break from teaching for a little bit. I wasn't planning on it being forever, but then 2020 with COVID happened and I had another baby. And so it just naturally happened that I never went back to teaching. And I couldn't ever fully articulate, even in my own mind, the way my understanding of the wellness world was changing. I did get as far as how white it is, but it was really only at the end of 2023 that it all clicked. That not only is the wellness world problematic because it's selling you something that doesn't necessarily work, right? It's not just go to a retreat, do yoga, and you'll be perfect. But it's actively perpetuating harm because it's keeping you within your own self-centered thinking. Because it's all self-care and it's all, hey, literally, it's like I've seen posts of teachers with large followings who are saying like, it's devastating what's happening. They usually won't say Palestine or Gaza, but you know what they're talking about, right? It's devastating what's happening over there. All human life has sanctity, whatever. The best we can do is to take care of our nervous systems, right? And no, that is not the best we can do as people of privilege. And that was something that even outside the wellness world, a lot of people in my life were responding when I would try to talk about Palestine. Oh no, I can't look at that stuff. I'm too sensitive. I've even heard people say, I'm too much of an empath. I can't look at that stuff. That's exactly saying you're not an empath if you aren't able to engage with what's happening. So yeah, I like evolved to just seeing how harmful the wellness world is.
Just on the back of that, I'd really love to ask you, would you love to see from us or from more people within the industry as facilitators within these spaces to support this decolonization of yoga and wellness and really supporting this collective liberation within the wellness space?
That's such a big question. And I ask myself that all the time. I think we all need to take massive steps back. And it's a huge ask, like to decolonize your thinking and your work, what you teach. It's like the most humbling practice. I don't know how many people have it within them to actually be outside of their ego and to come from more of a place of, wait, I need to learn from and listen to people who have that like ancestral connection.
Yeah.
But that's going to require sacrifice, right? And the tricky thing is a lot of these people don't think they are in their ego in living this way because they're so spiritual, because they've been a yoga teacher for 30 years, because they're so nice. They're such nice people that they don't think they're in the wrong in any way. And if at this point, when over the last 10 months, you haven't come to that humble awakening that you are part of the problem, I don't know that it's possible. I'm sorry, that's so negative. I think what I would like to see is a new community of teachers and students growing from this decolonized mindset, from acknowledging the harm that this industry has done and continues to do and actively separating from it. And also, I want to see people, if they say Loka Samasa Suki no Bhavantu, which is may all beings everywhere be free. When I hear that these days, I'm just like, do you really mean that? Is that a real, authentic prayer that you want all beings everywhere to be free? And if so, what are you doing about it? Because otherwise, what are you saying? And so until these deep things are thought about within individual teachers and practitioners, that's what needs to happen to change. And I think it's amazing that like you're using your voice and your identity to do that.
But even with that, I think that there is something there around really developing our capacity to listen to one another without the need to instantly attack. Like that for me is something that really needs to change. Like the amount of times that I myself or other people who I know have posted things and then instantly you get like a barrage of people sending you shit, which is quite harmful, which is quite pointed, which is quite insulting. It's so important for us to be able to actually think about what someone else is saying and see how it lands for us without the need to jump on it instantly.
Yeah.
That for me is just, it should just be basic human interaction.
It's the listening. What you're pointing to is we need to listen more.
And I guess that's present within within anti-racism or white supremacy, like instantly our reaction of, but I'm not racist or anything like that. It's just as soon as we jump into that defensive place, the conversation is almost like over. It's so important for us to be able to take that stance, to be like, actually, okay, what is this person saying? Where am I coming from? And like, how can I find myself in what they're saying? I think developing our capacity, and that's just developing our humanness. I feel
Exactly.
It's not even like it shouldn't even be a complicated thing, but it seems to be very complicated within the world that we're living in. Is there anything that you wanted to add from our conversation today?
It's been really lovely connecting with you. Thank you for asking me on and for your support of the podcast too. Like I know you've been doing yours for a few years now, and any support helps. So for more people to listen, and you need people to leave those ratings and reviews, don't you? It's but no, I'm so glad there are more of us having these interactions, and it does give me hope that humanity is not fully lost. Like we are rebuilding, and thank you.
Totally. I agree. Thank you so much, Leah. I will put all of your information in the show notes. People can find your podcast and all links to you. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really great. It occurred to me in our last editor's notes when we recorded for Sophie's episode that people might not know who you are. Because who's this woman that's come on in? So actually, I thought that what we should do is just introduce you. This is Lucy, my editor and producer extraordinaire for the Higher Love with Megan podcast. But yeah, I just thought that it would be great to introduce you, if you would like to just introduce yourself, and maybe just asking you a question around, how are you finding these conversations? How are you finding this podcast, and just anything that you feel like you'd like to share?
Oh, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I hadn't even considered. How dare people not know who I am? Yes, I am Lucy Lucraft, and I'm a podcast producer, formerly a journalist. And I'm very lucky that Megan came into my world via your fiance, whose podcast I also produced.
Thank you. And why don't we just jump in discussing the episode with Leah? What did you think?
I really enjoyed it. So I hadn't heard of Leah before you had introduced me to her podcast, Voices on the Side, which is a great podcast. And so it's not like I've binged all of her podcasts, so I knew what was coming or knew what she was going to say. For me, it felt quite an exciting podcast because she's clearly somebody who has been doing a lot of kind of analysis of her own biases and kind of looking internally at all the beliefs that she held that she doesn't want to hold anymore. And so it felt like a really grounding episode with someone who is like, like not necessarily in that messy first bit where maybe you're a bit like, don't have the language, or maybe you're feeling really angry at yourself and other people. So those conversations are also great, but but I really loved it. How did you feel about it?
I loved it. I mean, I love Leah's podcast. I find all of her episodes incredibly thought-provoking and really interrogating my perceptions, my own thoughts, and really expansive in that capacity. So I was really excited to get her on, and especially because I hear her obviously within the podcast as the host, not the person who's being interviewed. And that's why it occurred to me, first off, to get her on as a guest, because imagining the journey that she must have been on as a podcast host, going from, where she was at the beginning, having specific types of guests, to where she is now, interviewing a whole array of different people with differing opinions on differing topics, and bringing so many different voices on the side to the center within the conversation. I thought to myself, like, wow, as an individual, when you've had that many conversations with different people on different topics, how expansive that must be for your own mind. So that really fascinated me, like the journey that Leah has been on herself as a podcast host. So that was really what inspired me to invite Leah on as a guest. And There was one thing that really stuck out to me actually when I listened back to the edited episode. She spoke about soul loss, like how white supremacy and, our systems of oppression, and especially within the context of the last 10 months, what we've been witnessing, and her speaking to a term that I hadn't heard of as soul loss, which is when all of us are existing within this system, and especially when we are perhaps turning the other cheek or not speaking up or not caring and finding a place of like apathy or neutrality or like carrying on as normal, what that must take from us on a very deep, perhaps unconscious, but like very, very deep, profound level, for us to be able to separate ourselves out from this like huge collective that we're a part of. I found that so interesting. And, it was also like, okay, I'm going to have to contact Leah again and get her to come back on and speak. Leah, come back. Specifically because, I had never thought about how white supremacy harms white people, which I don't say of like trying to take away how much worse it is on Black people and people of color, because it is. But I'd never thought about it on how it harms white people and how it harms everyone within the system because of how much it separates us from our humanity.
100%, yeah. And actually Leah did talk a bit more to that when she was talking about her own community, which I think is all linked together, and how her proximity to whiteness benefits her, and she knows how to use those benefits. And that has, that also causes harm to you, because I can really relate to that myself as a biracial person, but somebody who is a very light-skinned biracial person. Yeah. So white supremacy 100% hurts us all. I think for me, it was an opportunity to go deeper into the soul loss and that piece.
Yeah, definitely. I find sometimes that when you've got a guest who says so many amazing things within the space of a few minutes, it's like my brain goes in like 100 directions at once. And it's only when you listen back to it that you're like, whoa, how did I not go in that direction? But, there's always a number of endless possibilities in which we can go within a podcast. And, just have to just have to trust that it was, the way that it was meant to be. But this nugget around soul loss is really something that I'm going to give a lot more consideration and exploration to for myself.
And who's next on the podcast?
Who is next on the podcast? That is a good question. So next up on the podcast, we have Jacqueline Kelly, who has her Instagram as Our Brave Hearts. She was an amazing guest to speak to. The way that she articulates things is so impressive. And the podcast was really around matrescence, so the passage of motherhood, and deconstructing a lot of our societal narratives around motherhood, normalizing a lot of things around motherhood that perhaps is not in the mainstream, talking about this kind of continual birth and rebirth process that mothers go through, being a mother to a baby, a toddler, a child, an adolescent, an adult, and also how motherhood has been carried into the last 10 months of her activism, her humanism in regards to Palestine, and how being a mother has really impacted her throughout this time too. So she's a great guest, and it'll be up next week. Cool. Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references, and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.